Happy Sunday. Today is June 2nd, and this is episode 11 of the Getting Started with Kubernetes series. Today we're going to be covering application updates using deployments. Last week we covered deployments, pods, replica sets, and now we're going to talk about post-deployment, how you update your applications and going through that process. So as typical, right, we want to make sure that we have the Kubernetes.io site up, and you can see here I have the site up in the right hand corner, and on the left hand side we have our WSL machine. We talked about that last week. Let's just make sure we can get to our cluster. So our cluster is there, and let's do a clear, and let's look at our deployment that we made last week, which was this deployment here, this Nginx deployment, which is version 1.14.2. So let's make sure that's all up and working here. So okay, get deployments or deploy Nginx deployments. Deployment, excuse me. And you can see here I have my Nginx deployment scaled to 5 replicas. We actually talked about replica scaling too, so we won't cover that today. That was covered last week. We're really focusing on updating our applications within our deployment spec. So let's clear this, and now we're going to do a K describe deploy Nginx deployment. Okay, so let's scroll up, and as you can see here, we have our deployment spec. Now I want to go over a couple things before we actually get into the actual updates, and we're going to talk about, as typical in Kubernetes, there are generally multiple ways of doing the same thing, and we'll talk about the couple ways of doing the actual updates to the actual application. We'll talk about rolling back the application in case something happens. We'll talk about canary deployments, which is what you'll want to put into practice in your production environments as you update your application. So the first thing we're going to do is, of course, we have Nginx, right? This was based on this YAML specification that we did last week, and we deployed this. And at the time we had 3 replicas, and we scaled that out to 5 replicas, okay? So that's why you see 5 replicas, and you can actually go in here and see that the replicas are 5 desired, 5 updated, 5 total, 5 available. What we're going to be focusing on are these 2 lines here, strategy type and rolling update strategy. So the strategy type is a rolling deployment or rolling update of your actual pods. What does that mean? It means that when I go through and do an image update on the pods within my deployment, it's actually going to do that in a rolling fashion, meaning it's not going to take all of those pods down, right, and then deploy new pods with the update, okay? It's going to do it in a rolling fashion to make sure you're up all the time, your application's up all the time, okay? And we want to go back here to the site, right? We go into managing workloads, and we scroll down, right? Let's scroll down to this, updating your application without an outage. And that's really what we're talking about here. We're upgrading your application without outage. That's what the rolling update gives you. The rolling update strategy defines 2 things, okay? You'll have a % max unavailable and a % max surge. So let's talk about the first one. The % max available, which is 25% by default, okay, basically says that the maximum unavailable pods in a replica set is 25% of the total replicas, okay? So in my case, I have 5 replicas. So basically what this means is I can only have 1 replica down at any given time, okay? The 25% max surge is how many additional pods can I deploy during my rolling update, okay? So what's that mean? So what we're going to do is we're actually going to go back to here to Nginx, the image down here, okay? And we see we're on 1.14.2. Let's assume that this application is your custom application and it's 1.14.2, and the new update, and obviously this wouldn't follow the typical versioning process, right, is say 1.16.1. Let's just assume that that's the next update version, okay? What's going to happen is, because we have a rolling update strategy of 25% max unavailable, it's never going to bring more than 1 down, okay, during the update, and it's going to surge only 1 additional above excuse me, 125% above the replicas, right? So it would go to 6 as an example, right? So that means that I can deploy the new pod with the latest image, and I can take one pod away, right, as soon as that one is ready. Okay? So let me reiterate that again. When I go through the update process, I'm actually going to change the image, right? I'm actually going to point to my new image that I have built for the updated application, the updated version. So in the updated version, we're going to go to 116.1. When I deploy this, right, when I do the rollout, okay, what's going to happen is it's going to deploy one additional pod with the latest update at a given time and only take one away at any given time, okay, until all the 5 have been updated. So this gives you an application, right, that's always on, always available. Now, in a specific time frame, you're going to have a mix of versioning, right, but eventually it'll all become version 1.16.1. Now, later on, we're going to talk about canary deployments. This is something that you're going to want to put in practice versus how I'm going to do this today. How I'm doing this today is just showing you some of the commands and showing you the process of what happens within Kubernetes when you do an update, as well as looking at your application rollout strategy, okay? That's really fundamentally what I'm trying to get across today. The way I'm doing it, however, is, not really the best way to do it, right? You're going to want to do what's called a canary deployment. And again, I'm going to set that aside for now. We'll talk about that at the end before we finish up. But the canary deployment is how you're going to want to do your updates to make sure that the application's working, right? And you're not impacting, your amount of users. So what happens if you deploy an update and something happens in that deployment and it fails? You want to be able to roll back quickly, but also I don't want to impact all these users that have access to the application at any given time, right? So there's 2 things that we're trying to avoid here. We want to be able to roll back quickly, which we can do, but we also don't want to do a massive impact all up front, which is what the canary deployment will help you do. So how are we going to do this? So let's go down to our command line, and we're going to hit clear. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're actually going to use the set image command to update our deployment with the 1.16.1 release. So again, there are a couple ways of doing this too. You can actually use the full, I don't know if you call it the FQDN, it's not really FQDN, but the full name of the deployment, which is v1. And you can get that by going deployment.v1.apps. I know it's crazy, right, how this works, but you don't have to do that. Of course, we're going to use the kind deployment, right? So we're going to do a set image command on the deployment name. So let's do a copy. We'll paste that in, and we're going to now set the image for our deployment, nginx deployment, which has already been deployed. So let's hit enter, excuse me. And now we're going to do a status, right? And watch this. And you can see here, it's very, very fast. Deployment, nginx deployment successfully rolled out. Let's do a get replica set. And you can see here the old replica set, right, has been basically removed, and the new replica set has been integrated now. As we do a get deploy nginx deployment, you can see our deployment is up to date and ready. And now we're going to do a clear, and we're going to do a kubectl, which is K, describe deploy nginx deployment. Now you can see here that we still have our replicas of 3, and now our image is at 116.1. So we've successfully updated our application to the latest, let's assume this is the latest release of 116.1. I believe nginx now is like 1.27 something, but again, we're assuming that this is an application that you wrote in your environment, or your developers wrote. They've already built the image, right, and uploaded it to your image repository, and now you're just pulling that image down and updating your pods in your deployment spec. Now, let's look at worst case scenario. What happens if something fails, right? So let's assume that this failed and your users can't get to it. How do I roll back? Is there an easy way to roll back? And the answer is yes. So let's clear this, We'll go back to our reference, and now we're going to go back here to look at a couple things. So the first thing we're going to look at is the history. All right, so let's copy the history command and put a / here, Nginx deployment of our name. And you can see here that we have a couple revisions, right? We have a revision 3 and a 4, and basically you have a previous revision, right, which is a 114.2, and a new revision, which is a 116.1. So essentially you can point to a revision number, or you can just do the previous revision number. So I only have one revision to go back to, so I'm going to do the previous, right? So I'm going to do a, look at the next command, the kubectl rollout command. We're going to do a k rollout undo deployment Nginx deployment. So what this will do is it will roll it back. And you can see here what's happening. We're now rolling back, right? And looks like we've already rolled back. So let's go here and do a k describe deployment, Nginx deployment. And let's make sure that our application is up. Yep, 3 is up. And I'm back to version 1.14.2. So if something happens, you can easily and quickly roll back your application, which is a nice thing in case something does happen. Now, one thing you can do here too is, I want to go through some of these commands, right? So the status command with the watch is extremely important, because if you have an application that takes a little bit longer, this one's very, very fast. It pulls the image, it's fast, right? But say you have an application that's a little bit longer, you can actually watch it go through the deployment, or the rollout, excuse me, of the update. So you can do Nginx deployment, and what will happen is it'll sit there until it's done, right? So it'll be an active watching state, and it'll go, okay, replica 1 is done, replica 2, or 1 out of 3, or 1 out of 2 out of 3, or 3 out of 3 is done, right? And it'll complete, okay? So you can actually watch it. Again, you've seen me use the watch command before. The watch, excuse me, not really the watch command, but the watch setting, right? The -w or the -- watch will show you live activity of what's happening. One thing also you can do is you can look at the history, okay, which we showed you before, of the revisions, right? You can see the history here. And you can also annotate. So if you wanted to actually add an annotation to the change, right? So maybe I say during the initial rollout the annotation is 1.14.2, but in this I want to label it upgrade to 1.16.1. That'll be in the change cause field here, okay? And that's something that you'll want to do as well. Okay, there was a couple more things that I wanted to actually show you here. So let's go to back here. We'll scroll down. We already talked about the max surge and the max unavailable. Again, those are settings that you can add into your deployment spec. So under the template, right, you also can put in an update strategy. And again, these fields here can help you define these settings within your deployment. Okay, so you can actually change these. These are the defaults, remember, because I didn't specify this in my deployment specification up here. You don't see that listed here. So the 25% is default, but you can actually change this under your template. So under template, you can put, I believe it lines up with template or spec. Does it line up with spec? No, it lines up with template. So under your template, right, you could come down here and you can say update, and you can see here, right, that because I'm using, and again, this is a bad habit, because I'm using Visual Studio Code, right, I'm able to actually leverage GitHub Copilot and automatically fills these in, or assumes, or tries to assume what you're trying to do, right, within your specification. So I typed in UPD, it knew that update strategy was part of that, and it goes into the, okay, well, what does it look like? You can do a max unavailable 1, max surge 1. If I put 2, it'd be 2 pods. Now it's not a percentage, right? I'm now specifying the number of pods, right, that I can have down. So that's the difference. You can specify a percentage in here if you'd like, but in this case they're using numbers 1 and 1, okay? But that's generally what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to specify your update strategy, making sure that your application's always running, and making sure that your updates go through smoothly. Now, I'm going to end it on this. What you're going to want to do is what's called a canary deployment. Let's do a search on that. Okay? And a canary deployment is extremely important to really look at in production in a real world use case. So what does a canary deployment do? So essentially what a canary deployment does, right, is it allows you to deploy a small upgraded replica, right, or replicas for your updated application. So for example, what I would do is I would create what's called a canary deployment. So it's going to managing resources under canary deployment, and where you would use different labeling within your YAML specification, and you would label what's called a track. Okay, so the track label, right, under labels, you can see here we have labels up here in our specification. What I would do is I would say, okay, track stable. Okay, that is my original 1.14.2 deployment. And then when you create a new release, right, of this application, right, you can then put in track canary, and and you can define how many replicas are there, right? And so what you're doing is you're saying, okay, I want to say, okay, let's just say, for example, I have 3 replicas of this application that I know are on a stable release of 1.14.2, but the 1.16.1 release, we don't know if it's 100% stable in production. We tested it, validated it, right? It appears to be stable, but we don't want to impact the application and the users accessing the application. So we're going to just point a specific number of users, or maybe an internal team, to test the 1.16.1 version in production. So at the same time, you have 1.14.2 and you have 1.16.1. The 1.14.2 will say, for example, we'll take 99% of the traffic, right? And or 1.16.1, you route 1% of the traffic to that. So what that does is your service, right, in this Nginx service is spanning both sets of replicas, right, by selecting the common labeling, right? And you can tweak this number, right? And you can grow into, okay, now I want 2 replicas, now I want 3 replicas, and I'm going to transition this to stable. So you see what I'm saying here? We're doing this in a methodical approach, updating your applications. That way you're making sure you have maximum available uptime, at the same time the maximum experience, right, for your end users. And that's the goal, right? The goal is to give your end users that are accessing the application the best experience possible. So again, I know this was long-winded for a small update to deployments. Extremely important to understand. Again, several ways of doing this. You can do the set image command. That's a declarative way of doing, or excuse me, an imperative way of doing things. The declarative way is going in and edit the YAML specification and changing that. Look at canary deployments. Make sure you understand how to undo your updates. Make sure you understand how to look at the revisions, or the versions, excuse me. Look at the version history, being able to actually point back to the version history if you have to roll back. Making sure you add annotations, and you can read that here within your updates, so you understand exactly what those annotations actually, what those versions actually did, right? So I can say versions 1, 2, and 3, but if there's nothing annotated there, I don't really know exactly what happened when I went from version 1 to version 2. What was version 1? Well, version 1 was 1.14.2, right? Version 2 is 1.16.1, an upgrade to 1.16.1. You want to label that in your history so that not only you know what it is, but other folks that are managing these clusters, which there will be, or if you get replaced or you go to a new job, when someone comes in, they have the ability to know exactly what's going on with that application running in your Kubernetes environment. So again, I hope you have a great rest of your Sunday today. Get some rest, charge up for the week, and have a great upcoming week.